Today we're looking at advantages and disadvantages in the Revolutionary War. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. So, as we begin to study the American Revolution and the battles and military action that took place during the war, it's important to recognize what the advantages and disadvantages were for each side going into the war. For the most part, you'll find that the British had just about every military advantage, yet there were other factors that came into play as the war wore on that would give the Americans, important advantages by the end. And although I won't hit every single factor favoring one side or the other, I will hit some of the big ones. So let's start with the British advantages. The British had overwhelming advantages compared to the Americans, and honestly, it's remarkable that in the end, and I'm sorry if this is a spoiler, but it's remarkable in the end that the Americans win the war. For the British, in the past 100 years prior to the Revolution, they had won just about every conflict they had been involved in, and they had defeated both the French and the Spanish. Their military was well trained and experienced. They had been in war before, and they knew how to handle themselves in a fight. They had commanders who had seen combat, that knew how to conduct a war. Furthermore, the British Army was well equipped. Despite still having the debt from the French and Indian War, the British still had the wealth of a worldwide empire that they could draw resources from. But then lastly, and arguably their greatest advantage, was that they had the strongest navy on the face of the earth. Ever since the British had defeated the Spanish Armada back in 1588, they had maintained their dominance at sea. The British had an estimated 270 warships when the war began, and that number rose to close to 500 by the war's end. The American disadvantages are basically the flip side of all of the British advantages. Unlike the British, the American military was untrained, unexperienced, and primarily made up of militia, which again were just citizen soldiers. They did not have experience like the British had. Many had fought in the French and Indian War, but overwhelmingly most had no military experience at all. Secondly, they were poorly equipped, poorly fed, poorly armed. I mean, remember, they're being supported by the Continental Congress, but the Continental Congress couldn't raise taxes on these newly formed states at this time to support the army. Instead, they had to kind of kindly ask for money from each state, which the states had no obligation to necessarily hand over any money. Also, you have to consider that not every American was in favor of independence. It was estimated that 1 in every 5 Americans was a loyalist, and loyalists could spy or pass information on to the British about the American movements. Lastly, the Americans had little to no navy. At the beginning of the war, it's estimated that the Americans had about 27 ships compared to 270 for the British, and actually that number went down to only 20 for the Americans by the end of the war. There were so few ships that the Continental Congress had to use privateers or privately owned merchant ships as naval vessels. Despite all of their advantages, there actually were a number of factors working against the British. The big one was the fact that they were fighting a war 3,000 miles across the ocean. It took weeks, if not months, to move troops and supplies to certain locations. Likewise, it took a long time for news of events and battles to travel back to Britain, and then for them to make decisions and send those decisions back to America. Along those same lines, the geographic vastness of the American colonies, being hundreds of miles long from north to south, was difficult to keep under control even once the British won battles in certain areas. Next, many of the British troops were hired soldiers or mercenaries. Many of these hired soldiers were Hessians, who were highly trained German soldiers. Yet throughout history, it has basically been proven if a soldier is fighting for a paycheck rather than fighting for their home or an ideal, they tend not to fight as hard or to be as resilient. And lastly, the war was unpopular back in Britain. They had fought the French and Indian War, which had left them deeply in debt, and many people in Britain did not necessarily see the value in fighting another war in North America. The Americans basically had home field advantage over the British. They knew the terrain, the geographic layout of where the war would be fought. They knew where the trails were through the woods and the best spots to fight. And so this would come in handy later in the war as the Americans began to adopt more guerrilla tactics as the war wore on. An enormous advantage for the Americans, and arguably this one is one they couldn't have won without, was aid from other foreign nations, primarily from France. The French aided financially to pay for supplies, as well as sending close to 12,000 French troops to support the Americans, as well as sending French naval forces to support the Americans. Lastly, though, and probably the most important advantage for the Americans, was that they were fighting to save their homes and fighting for their freedom. They weren't fighting for, a king or because a government had sent them to fight. They were fighting because they believed in what they were fighting for. And that made them a formidable force despite all of their disadvantages. So with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.